Good evening, my friend. Tonight, we are traveling far back in time to the young United States, to an era when forests stretched for hundreds of miles, roads were little more than narrow dirt paths, and many small settlements existed only as tiny dots on hand-drawn maps. Before we begin, settle into a comfortable position. Let your breathing become slow and easy. There is no hurry here. The night is quiet, the fire is warm, and our story unfolds at the gentle pace of history itself. Our tale is inspired by the forgotten corners of early America, where truth, memory, and folklore often blended together. Although the places and people you are about to meet are fictional, they live in a world shaped by the everyday lives of real Americans during the late 18th century. Now, let us begin. In the autumn of 1784, deep within the endless forests west of the Appalachian Mountains, there stood a village known simply as Ashbrook. You would not have found its name in any newspaper. Few merchants had ever heard of it. Even the nearest county officials mentioned it only occasionally, usually discussing taxes or supplies. Ashbrook was small, very small. Only 36 wooden homes stood along a winding dirt lane that followed the curve of a narrow creek. Smoke drifted peacefully from stone chimneys every morning. Chickens wandered freely between split-rail fences. Children chased each other beneath towering oak trees, while their parents worked quietly from sunrise until evening. Nothing remarkable ever seemed to happen there, and perhaps that was exactly why the village remained forgotten. Every day followed nearly the same gentle rhythm. The blacksmith began his work before dawn. The baker's wife lit her brick oven while the sky was still painted in deep shades of blue. Farmers walked toward their fields carrying simple wooden tools, worn smooth by decades of careful hands. The village school only welcomed a dozen children. Lessons were brief. Winters were long. Books were precious. Evenings belonged to stories. After supper, families gathered beside fireplaces. Grandparents remembered places they had left behind on the eastern coast. Mothers repaired clothing beneath candlelight. Fathers carved wooden toys or sharpened farming tools while listening to the steady crackle of burning oak logs. No one locked their doors. No one expected strangers. Life moved so slowly that people measured time not by clocks, but by seasons. Spring meant planting, summer meant growing, autumn meant harvesting, winter meant waiting. And somehow everyone seemed content with that quiet pattern. There was only one thing visitors often noticed. Every evening, without exception, every lantern in Ashbrook was extinguished before midnight. Not one remained burning. If a traveler happened to pass along the nearby forest road after midnight, the village looked completely abandoned. Dark windows, silent streets, not even the sound of conversation escaped into the cool night air. Some believed the villagers simply valued their sleep. Others whispered that the custom had existed long before anyone living could explain why. Whenever curious travelers asked about it, the villagers smiled politely. It has always been our way. Nothing more, nothing less. Among the villagers lived a school teacher named Jonathan Hale. At 32 years old, Jonathan had arrived in Ashbrook only 3 years earlier after teaching children in a much larger town farther east. Unlike most villagers, Jonathan kept detailed journals. Every evening before bed, he carefully described the weather, the harvest, unusual conversations, visiting birds, changing seasons, and the smallest events that most people quickly forgot. His handwriting was neat. His observations were patient. He believed ordinary days deserved to be remembered
just as much as extraordinary ones. One October evening, Jonathan sat beside his small fireplace, writing beneath the soft glow of a single candle. Outside, gentle rain tapped quietly against the windows. The village had already grown silent. He dipped his feather quill into ink and wrote, October 18th, 1784. The maples are nearly finished turning red. Mrs. Carter baked apple bread for the neighbors. Samuel repaired the old bridge over the creek. The geese flew south earlier than expected. Everything feels wonderfully ordinary. He paused. Then he smiled. Sometimes, he thought, history would someday care more about peaceful days than famous battles. He closed the journal, blew out the candle, and listened to the rain. Far across the Atlantic Ocean, great cities bustled with merchants, politicians, inventors, and explorers. But here, only the forest remained awake. Morning arrived wrapped in silver mist. The creek shimmered beneath the rising sun. Children laughed on their way to school. Nothing seemed different, yet Jonathan noticed something curious. The birds. Usually dozens of robins gathered near the schoolhouse every morning. That day there were none. Not a single song echoed through the trees. It was not frightening, only unusual. Perhaps the changing weather had driven them elsewhere. He thought little of it. By afternoon, another small mystery appeared. Old Abigail Turner, the oldest resident in Ashbrook, declined her usual afternoon walk. For nearly 20 years, she had slowly circled the village every single day using a polished hickory walking stick. Rain, snow, sunshine, it never mattered. But today she remained seated on her porch, quietly watching the forest. Jonathan waved. She smiled gently, yet her eyes never left the distant tree line. Later that evening, Jonathan stopped beside her gate. "Beautiful sunset," he said. "It is," she answered softly. After a long silence, she added something unexpected. "The forest grows quieter every autumn." Jonathan looked toward the trees. "They seem peaceful." Mrs. Turner nodded. Peaceful things often hide the oldest stories. Before Jonathan could ask what she meant, she simply wished him good night and returned inside. He smiled politely. The remark lingered in his thoughts only briefly. People often spoke poetically as they grew older. At least that's what he believed. That same evening, the village gathered inside the meeting house for the annual autumn supper. Long wooden tables filled the room. Roasted vegetables, fresh bread, salted pork, apple cider, pumpkin pies. Neighbors laughed quietly while children chased each other beneath benches. A traveling fiddler played slow melodies that drifted warmly through the candlelit hall. Jonathan noticed something interesting. Whenever conversation drifted toward the nearby forest, voices naturally became softer, almost careful. No one seemed eager to discuss the woods after sunset. Instead, they changed the subject. Harvests, weather, recipes, anything else. Later, as everyone prepared to leave, Jonathan overheard two elderly brothers speaking near the doorway. "It has been many years," one whispered. "Long enough," replied the other. "Do you think?" "No. But the signs? They always return." Jonathan turned slightly, hoping to hear more. Instead, both men smiled pleasantly as though nothing unusual had been said. They wished everyone a peaceful evening, then walked home beneath the rising moon. The village slowly emptied. Lanterns disappeared one by one. Doors closed gently. Within an hour, Ashbrook had once again surrendered itself to complete darkness. Jonathan stood outside for a moment before returning home. Above him stretched thousands of brilliant stars. Without city lights, the sky appeared almost endless. He could even see the pale ribbon of the Milky Way crossing silently overhead. Somewhere deep within the forest, an owl called once. Then everything became still, unusually still. Not a breeze stirred the leaves, not a single cricket sang, not a single dog barked. It lasted only a minute, perhaps two. Then the ordinary sounds of the night slowly returned. Jonathan smiled to himself. What an oddly quiet evening. He stepped inside his cottage, closed the wooden door, and recorded the final completely ordinary night Ashbrook would ever experience. Because before another sunrise arrived, the village's quiet history would begin its most extraordinary chapter.
The first light of dawn arrived quietly over Ashbrook. A pale golden glow filtered through the thick forest, touching the rooftops one by one before settling across the fields that surrounded the little village. Thin ribbons of mist floated above the creek, drifting lazily with the cool October air. Dew sparkled on every blade of grass, and the world appeared as calm as it always had. Jonathan Hale awoke before sunrise, just as he did every morning. He lit a small candle, folded his wool blanket, and opened the wooden shutters beside his bed. Usually, the village greeted him with familiar sounds: the cheerful crow of roosters, the distant chopping of firewood, the clatter of milk pails, children laughing before breakfast. Today, something was missing. The silence lingered a little longer than usual. Not complete silence, just enough to make an observant man pause. Jonathan dressed slowly, poured himself a cup of warm tea, and stepped outside. The cool morning air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. Across the road, Mr. Carter was already feeding his horses. Everything looked perfectly normal. "Good morning," Jonathan called. Mr. Carter raised a hand with a friendly smile. "Morning, schoolmaster." His voice sounded ordinary enough, yet Jonathan noticed the horses. Both animals stood perfectly still, staring toward the forest. Neither seemed interested in eating. They simply watched the dark tree line without moving. "Are they all right?" Jonathan asked. "I expect so," Mr. Carter replied. "They've been acting strangely since before dawn." Jonathan looked toward the woods. Nothing moved there, only endless rows of towering oak, maple, and pine trees stretching beyond sight. He thought little of it. Animals often behaved oddly before storms. Perhaps rain was coming. He continued walking toward the schoolhouse. Along the way, he greeted neighbors carrying baskets, chopping wood, hanging laundry, and sweeping porches. Everything followed its familiar rhythm. And yet, the village somehow felt quieter. Even conversations seemed shorter, more thoughtful, as though everyone sensed something they could not quite explain. Inside the small schoolhouse, 12 children settled into their benches. Jonathan began the morning lesson by reading from an old geography book. The children repeated each sentence carefully. Outside, sunlight poured through the windows. Hours passed peacefully. Near midday, 8-year-old Sarah Miller quietly raised her hand. "Yes, Sarah?" She hesitated. "My grandfather says we shouldn't whistle after sunset." Several children nodded immediately. Jonathan smiled kindly. "Did he tell you why?" Sarah shook her head. "He only says the forest listens." The classroom became unusually quiet. Jonathan glanced around. Every child appeared completely serious. "No one whistles after dark," another boy said softly. "My mother says it brings wandering feet." A little girl sitting near the window whispered, "My grandmother says someone might answer." Jonathan chuckled gently. Old stories often help people remember safety rules. The children remained silent. Finally, one boy spoke, "But nobody knows who made the rule." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. Many villages carried traditions whose origins had long been forgotten. Perhaps this was simply another. Still, he made a small note in his journal later that afternoon. Interesting local custom. Children strongly believe whistling after sunset is forbidden. No clear explanation given. It seemed harmless enough. After classes ended, Jonathan decided to take a longer walk than usual. Autumn had painted the countryside with rich shades of crimson, amber, and gold. Leaves drifted gently from towering branches, spinning lazily before settling across the winding road. He crossed the small wooden bridge over Ash Creek. The water moved slowly beneath him, clear enough to reveal smooth stones resting on the creek bed. Normally, fishermen stood along the banks this time of day. Today, there were none. Instead, Jonathan noticed something unusual resting against one of the bridge posts. A small wooden toy boat, hand-carved, beautifully made. Its tiny sail had been stitched from faded linen. Someone had carefully painted a blue bird across its side. Jonathan picked it up. The wood felt old, very old. He looked around for children. None appeared. Perhaps someone had forgotten it years ago. Yet it looked strangely clean, as though it had been placed there only moments earlier. He carried the little boat back toward the village. Near the bakery, he encountered old Abigail Turner once again. She immediately noticed the toy. "Where did you find that?" "Under the bridge." She stared at it for several seconds, then quietly asked, "Was it floating?" "No. It was resting against the wood." Mrs. Turner nodded very slowly. "I haven't seen one of those in many years." Jonathan examined the tiny boat. "It belongs to someone?" "It used to." She offered no further explanation. Instead, she gently touched the painted blue bird with one finger. Then she smiled sadly. "If I were you," she paused, "I'd leave it where you found it." Jonathan laughed softly. "It is only a toy." "So people once believed." Without another word, she continued walking down the road. Jonathan stood watching her disappear between the cottages. Her words echoed strangely in his mind. That evening, curiosity persuaded him to visit the village records stored inside the meeting house. The records occupied only one wooden cabinet. Births, deaths, marriages, land agreements, harvest reports. Simple documents carefully preserved for decades. Jonathan enjoyed reading them. Ordinary records often revealed extraordinary lives. As the afternoon sunlight faded through the windows, he discovered something curious. Every family appeared exactly where expected, except one, the Whitlock family. According to the records, Thomas Whitlock, his wife Eleanor, and their 2 daughters had settled in Ashbrook 23 years ago. Taxes had been recorded, harvests listed, even church attendance appeared regularly. Then, nothing. No death,
No departure, no explanation. The entries simply stopped. Jonathan searched through later records. No mention, no farewell, no property transfer. It was as though the family had quietly vanished from the pages themselves. He frowned. Surely there had to be an explanation. Perhaps another record book had been lost. Just then, the meeting house door opened. Reverend Samuel Brooks entered carrying several candles. "Working late?" he asked warmly. Jonathan smiled. "I've been reading old village records." The Reverend nodded approvingly. History deserves patient eyes. Jonathan hesitated. "Do you remember the Whitlock family?" The Reverend stopped walking. Only for a moment. Then he continued lighting candles. "I remember the name. What became of them?" "I honestly cannot say." "You never wondered?" "Years pass quickly." His answer sounded polite, yet strangely unfinished. Jonathan sensed the conversation had ended before it truly began. As sunset approached, villagers once again lit their lanterns. Warm orange light glowed from every cottage window. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the cool evening air. Children played one final game before being called inside. Everything appeared peaceful. Jonathan sat alone on the bench outside his cottage, writing.
A gentle fog rested over the fields, softening every fence, every tree and every rooftop, until the entire village looked as though it had been painted with quiet brushstrokes. Drops of dew clung to the autumn grass, catching the first light of the rising sun. Jonathan Hale awoke after a restless night. He could not remember dreaming, only that he had awakened several times with the strange feeling that someone was slowly walking past his cottage. Each time he listened carefully. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, only the wind moving gently through the trees. He dressed, prepared a simple breakfast of bread and honey, and opened his journal before leaving for school. October 20th, 1784. I continue to notice small details that refuse to fit together. The forgotten Whitlock family, the children's warnings, the old toy boat, the silence in the forest. Each piece appears ordinary by itself, yet together they suggest a story no one wishes to tell. He closed the journal. Outside, the village was slowly coming to life. Mrs. Carter swept her front porch. The blacksmith's hammer rang steadily against glowing iron. A pair of boys chased chickens through the lane until their mothers called them back with gentle laughter. Everything looked perfectly normal, and yet Jonathan had begun seeing Ashbrook differently. He found himself noticing not only what was present, but also what seemed quietly absent. The old men no longer sat beneath the great oak after supper. Children stopped their games earlier than before. Even the village dogs rarely wandered beyond the last fence near the forest. It was as though an invisible line surrounded the settlement, one that everyone respected without ever speaking about it. Later that morning, after lessons had ended, Jonathan decided to visit the home of Elias Morton. If anyone knew the history of Ashbrook, it was Elias. At nearly 80 years old, he had lived there longer than anyone except Mrs. Abigail Turner. His cottage stood at the edge of the village beside a weathered apple orchard. Jonathan found him repairing an old wooden wheel. "Good afternoon, Mr. Morton." The elderly man smiled warmly. "School finished already?" "For today." Jonathan admired the carefully arranged tools hanging inside the small workshop. Every hammer, saw, and chisel rested in their proper place. "You've always enjoyed asking questions," Elias said without looking up. "Have I become that predictable?" "The curious rarely change." They shared a quiet smile. After a moment, Jonathan asked, "Do you remember the Whitlock family?" The old man's hands stopped moving, only for a heartbeat. Then he continued sanding the wheel. "I remember many families. What became of them?" Elias brushed away the wood dust. "Some moved east, some west. Some were buried in the churchyard." "And the Whitlocks?" The old man remained silent. A full minute passed. Finally, he answered, "I cannot tell you what I do not know." His words sounded honest, yet they carried the careful weight of someone choosing them with great precision. Jonathan sensed there was more, much more, but pressing further felt impolite. Instead, Elias changed the subject. "Would you like to see something?" He disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a lever tube tied with faded blue ribbon. Inside rested several hand-drawn maps. The oldest paper had turned yellow with age. Its edges had become soft from decades of careful handling. "This was drawn before I was born," Elias explained. "One of the first surveyors made it." Jonathan carefully spread the map across the workbench. Ashbrook appeared exactly where expected. The creek, the bridge, the meeting house, nearby hills, even several old hunting trails. Everything seemed accurate, until Jonathan noticed something impossible. A wide open space appeared just north of the village. No trees, no hills, nothing. Only a blank section nearly half a mile across. "Was this unfinished?" Jonathan asked. Elias leaned closer. "It has always looked that way." "The surveyor forgot to draw it?" "Perhaps." Jonathan frowned. Surveyors rarely left empty spaces, especially not in the middle of completed maps. Every river, every hill, every woodland, everything had been carefully recorded. Only this single patch remained untouched. He gently ran one finger across the faded paper. The surface felt slightly rougher there, almost as though something had once been drawn and later erased. "Has anyone made a newer map?" Jonathan asked. Elias nodded. "Yes, several." "And do they also leave this place blank?" "They do." Jonathan looked up. "Why?" The old man smiled kindly. "I've wondered the same thing for 60 years." The answer lingered between them. It sounded truthful, yet incomplete. Jonathan thanked him for the maps and walked slowly back toward the village. The afternoon remained unusually warm for late October. Golden leaves drifted lazily across the road. Children laughed beside the creek. Smoke curled peacefully from stone chimneys. Everything looked exactly as it had only days before. Still, The blank space on the map refused to leave his thoughts. That evening, he visited the tiny church library. It contained fewer than 50 books. Most were religious texts brought from England years earlier. Others described farming, medicine, or navigation. Hidden among them sat a thick leather volume simply titled County Land Survey, 1761. Jonathan carefully opened it. The brittle pages crackled softly beneath his fingertips. He turned slowly through property lines, measurements, and settlement records. Then he found another map. Again Ashbrook appeared. Again the creek curved gently beside the village. Again the same empty place. Only this time someone had written 3 small words near the blank area. The ink had faded almost beyond recognition. Jonathan leaned closer. After several moments, he managed to read them. No settlement recorded. He whispered the words aloud. No settlement recorded. That seemed strangely unnecessary. Surveyors normally marked places that existed, not places that didn't. Why specifically write that no settlement stood there? His thoughts were interrupted by Reverend Brooks entering quietly with an armful of books. "I thought I might find you here." Jonathan smiled. "I've become fascinated by these old maps." The Reverend set the books upon a table. They have a way of asking more questions than they answer. Jonathan hesitated. "Have you ever walked north beyond the creek?" The Reverend looked toward the window. "Only once." "What did you find?" "Trees." "And?" "More trees." His answer carried a gentle smile, but Jonathan sensed it was not the complete truth. As sunset approached, villagers gathered outside to bring animals into their barns. Jonathan noticed something else. Every cow, Jonathan Hale remained standing outside his cottage for several long moments. The cool October air settled gently around him. Above, the stars shone with remarkable clarity. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a pale ribbon of scattered light, and somewhere far beyond the hills, an owl called only once before silence returned. The distant light still glowed. It was small, steady, golden, not bright enough to illuminate the forest, yet impossible to ignore. Jonathan rubbed his eyes. Perhaps fatigue had played a trick on him. He looked again. The light remained exactly where it had been, near the northern edge of the woods, beyond the creek, beyond the final fence surrounding Ashbrook. He considered walking toward it. The distance was not great, perhaps half a mile. Even by moonlight, he could probably reach it within 20 minutes. Yet something held him back. Not fear, only caution. Traveling unfamiliar woodland at night had never been wise. A twisted root or hidden stream could cause serious injury long before sunrise. After another minute, Jonathan quietly returned inside. He closed the door, pulled the curtain across the window, yet before lying down, he opened his journal once more. By the fading light of a single candle, he carefully wrote, "Just after midnight, I observed a solitary light north of the village. No known home exists there. I also heard footsteps upon the road, although no traveler could be seen. I shall investigate after sunrise." He placed the journal beside his bed, blew out the candle, and waited for sleep. Morning arrived wrapped in a blanket of soft fog. The eastern sky slowly brightened until sunlight spilled gently across Ashbrook's rooftops. Everything appeared peaceful. Roosters crowed. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children hurried through the village carrying books beneath their arms. If anyone else had witnessed the mysterious light during the night, no one mentioned it. Jonathan finished breakfast quickly. Instead of walking toward the schoolhouse, he crossed the small bridge over Ash Creek and continued north. The farther he walked, the quieter the world became. The village sounds slowly disappeared behind him. Soon only the whisper of wind remained. Tall oaks formed a natural arch above the narrow footpath. Golden leaves drifted lazily to the forest floor. Sunlight filtered through thousands of branches, creating gentle patches of light and shadow that moved almost like slow waves upon the earth. Jonathan followed no particular trail. He simply walked toward the place where he believed the mysterious light had appeared. After nearly half an hour, he reached an open clearing. It was beautiful. Wildflowers still bloomed despite the cool season. Ancient maple trees surrounded the meadow. A small stream crossed one corner before disappearing beneath thick ferns. Nothing seemed unusual. No cabin, no chimney, no sign of anyone having lived there. Jonathan smiled to himself. Perhaps he had imagined the light after all. He was about to return home when something caught his attention. Near the edge of the clearing, the grass grew differently. Instead of spreading naturally across the ground, it formed two long parallel lines stretching into the forest. He walked closer. The earth beneath the grass felt unusually firm, almost flat. He knelt, brushing away fallen leaves with his hand, then more and more. Beneath them appeared packed soil, old, smooth, remarkably straight. It looked almost like a road. Not a modern road, nothing built from stone, simply an ancient wagon path worn deep into the earth by countless wheels many years before. Jonathan stood quietly. He looked behind him. The path continued all the way toward Ashbrook. He looked ahead. It vanished into the forest, hidden beneath centuries of fallen leaves. How had no one mentioned this? He followed it carefully. The farther he walked, the clearer it became. The road had once been important, wide enough for two wagons to pass comfortably. Large oak trees now grew directly through portions of it, suggesting it had been abandoned for decades, perhaps longer. Nature had worked patiently to reclaim it, yet traces remained. Here and there, Jonathan noticed weathered fence posts nearly swallowed by moss, broken stone markers, fragments of rusted iron almost buried beneath the soil, signs that people had once traveled this way regularly. Then he found something remarkable. Half hidden beneath ivy rested a wooden signpost. Only its lower half remained standing. Time had worn away nearly every letter. Jonathan brushed away moss with extraordinary care. One faint word slowly appeared. Brook. Only those final 5 letters remained readable. Ashbrook? Perhaps. Or another place entirely. The beginning had disappeared long ago. He carefully copied the letters into his notebook, then continued walking. Nearly another quarter-mile passed before the road ended, not gradually, abruptly. One moment the packed earth continued beneath his feet. The next, nothing. The path simply stopped. Ahead stretched untouched forest. No clearing, no buildings, no ruins, no explanation. Jonathan slowly turned in a full circle. The silence surrounding him felt different, Not unpleasant, only deep, very deep, as though the forest itself had been listening for generations. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine needles. Far above, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily through the clear autumn sky. Jonathan smiled. Perhaps old settlements had existed here long before Ashbrook. Roads were abandoned all the time. People moved. Forests reclaimed the land. History often vanished quietly. Still, the missing destination troubled him. Roads were built to lead somewhere. This one seemed determined to forget where it led. By early afternoon, Jonathan returned to the village. His boots carried traces of damp earth and fallen leaves. Near the blacksmith shop, he encountered young Daniel Carter, barely 14 years old, carrying a bucket of water. "You've been in the North Woods," the boy observed. "I have." Daniel hesitated. "My father says people don't usually go there." "Why not?" The boy shrugged. "I don't know. He just says there's nothing worth finding." Jonathan smiled gently. "What if someone wishes only to take a peaceful walk?" The boy considered the question, then quietly answered, "My grandfather says peaceful walks sometimes become long stories." Before Jonathan could ask what that meant, the boy hurried away. Another curious sentence, another mystery wrapped inside ordinary conversation. That evening, Jonathan spread several maps across the table inside his cottage. The newest survey, the oldest survey, his own sketches from the day's walk. One detail immediately stood out. None of the official maps showed the abandoned road. Not one. It was as if the path had never existed, yet he had walked upon it, touched it, measured portions of it with his own footsteps. He carefully drew its location beside Ashbrook. The forgotten road pointed directly toward the mysterious blank space that appeared on every historical map. His heartbeat quickened slightly. Surely this could not be coincidence. Just then, a soft knock came at the door. Jonathan opened it. Mrs. Abigail Turner stood outside holding a woven basket. "I baked too much bread," she said with a gentle smile. "I thought you might help me solve the problem." Jonathan laughed warmly. "I would be honored." She stepped inside. For several minutes they spoke only of weather, apples, and the approaching winter. Then Mrs. Turner noticed the maps covering the table. Her smile faded. "You found the old road." It was not a question. Jonathan looked up. "You know about it?" She nodded slowly. "Most of the older folk do." "Why has no one mentioned it?" Mrs. Turner gently traced one finger along the line Jonathan had drawn. "Because every generation decides it is kinder not to."
The following morning arrived with a gentle rain. Fine drops drifted through the cool autumn air, coating the rooftops of Ashbrook with a silver shimmer. Smoke rose slowly from the chimneys, disappearing into low gray clouds that hung quietly above the valley. Jonathan Hale stood at his window with a warm mug of tea in his hands. Normally, rainy mornings felt comforting. Today, they felt thoughtful. Mrs. Abigail Turner's words from the previous evening refused to leave his mind. Some places disappear long before anyone realizes they are gone. He repeated the sentence softly. It sounded less like a warning and more like a memory. School lessons passed peacefully. The children practiced reading aloud while rain tapped softly against the small windows. During the afternoon break, Jonathan noticed something curious. Instead of playing outside between the showers, every child remained inside. Some read quietly. Others carved small wooden animals. A few simply watched the rain. Finally, Jonathan asked the oldest student, 12-year-old Benjamin Carter, "Does no one enjoy playing in the rain?" Benjamin smiled politely. "We do." "Then why stay inside?" The boy hesitated before answering. "My grandmother says rainy days belong to remembering." Jonathan smiled. "And what are we supposed to remember?" Benjamin looked toward the window. "I don't think anyone remembers anymore."
Jonathan Hale stood motionless among the old graves. The evening air had grown cooler, carrying the familiar scent of damp leaves and fresh earth. Above him, the last rays of sunlight faded behind the western hills, leaving the valley bathed in quiet shades of blue and amber. The church bell no longer rang. Neither did the distant one. For several long moments, the world became perfectly still. Jonathan wondered if he had imagined the second bell. The sound had been so faint, so impossibly distant, yet unmistakably real. It had carried the deep, rich tone of an old bronze bell, the kind cast by skilled craftsmen generations earlier. He looked around the cemetery. The wind gently moved through the oak branches. Nothing else stirred. That night, Jonathan slept little. His thoughts wandered endlessly between the abandoned road, the missing pages from Nathaniel Pierce's journal, and the mysterious bell hidden somewhere beyond the northern forest. Before dawn, he rose quietly. Instead of preparing lessons, he packed a small satchel. Inside, he placed a loaf of fresh bread, a flask of water, a lantern, 2 candles, his journal, a compass, and the oldest map Elias Morton had shown him. He intended only a short walk, just enough to satisfy his growing curiosity. The village still slept as Jonathan crossed the bridge over Ash Creek. Mist floated gently above the water. Morning birds had not yet begun their songs. His boots followed the forgotten wagon road once more. In daylight, it appeared even older than before. Grass covered much of its surface. Moss wrapped itself around broken fence posts. Large tree roots slowly pushed upward through the earth, quietly reclaiming the path one season at a time. Jonathan walked slowly. He paid close attention to every detail. After nearly an hour, he reached the place where the road had seemed to vanish the previous day. Today, something felt different. Perhaps it was the early morning light. Perhaps it was simply that he looked more carefully. To his left stood an enormous white oak, unlike any other tree nearby. Its trunk measured nearly 12 feet across. One side had been struck by lightning many years ago, leaving a long scar that twisted upward into the branches. Jonathan approached it. Near the base of the tree, almost hidden beneath moss, someone had carved a small symbol into the bark. A circle. Inside it, a tiny 6-pointed star. The carving had become weathered with age. It could easily have remained unnoticed for decades. Jonathan copied the symbol into his notebook. He had never seen anything quite like it. Continuing beyond the oak, he noticed something unusual beneath his feet. The forest floor no longer felt natural.
The ground had become strangely level, too level, as though many hands had once cleared and flattened the land long ago. He crouched beside a patch of moss, carefully brushing away leaves. Stone, a flat stone, perfectly square. He uncovered another, then another. Soon a rough outline emerged. Not random stones, a foundation, the remains of a small building. Its walls had long disappeared. Nature had hidden almost every trace, yet the shape remained. Jonathan stood silently. A building had once stood here, exactly where every map claimed nothing had ever existed. He continued searching. Within minutes he discovered another foundation, then another, smaller, larger, different shapes, some square, some rectangular, each separated by narrow gaps resembling tiny streets. His heartbeat quickened. This had not been a single cabin. It had been a settlement, small, orderly, carefully planned. The trees now stood where homes once stood. Birds nested where chimneys once released warm smoke into the evening sky. Grass covered what had once been doorways. The forest had patiently erased nearly everything, yet not completely. Jonathan walked deeper into the hidden clearing. Sunlight filtered softly through the towering branches above. Despite the beauty surrounding him, something felt remarkably peaceful. Not frightening, not threatening, simply still. The silence differed from ordinary silence. Normally, forests overflowed with life, birdsong, insects, rustling leaves. Here, almost nothing. No robins, no squirrels, no woodpeckers tapping against bark. Only the gentle movement of wind. He remembered Mrs. Turner's words, "Turn around before the birds become quiet." Only now did he realize the birds had already become quiet. Near the center of the clearing stood a circular stone well. Unlike the ruined foundations, it remained almost untouched. Its stones were fitted together with extraordinary care. Moss covered much of the surface, but the structure itself remained solid. Jonathan approached cautiously. Looking inside, the well appeared dry. Far below rested nothing but darkness. He picked up a small pebble, dropped it. Several seconds passed. Finally, a faint click echoed upward, much deeper than expected. He estimated the well must descend nearly 60 feet, perhaps more. Carved on one of the upper stones appeared the same symbol he had seen on the great oak, a circle, a six-pointed star. Someone had marked both places intentionally, but why? Hours slipped quietly past. Jonathan carefully sketched everything, the foundations, the well, the carved symbol, the position of each structure. The hidden settlement slowly emerged across the pages of his notebook. Then he noticed one final feature. At the northern edge of the clearing stood a low stone wall, almost completely buried beneath ivy. Beyond it, rows of weathered markers, not houses, graves, a cemetery, smaller than Ashbrook's, older, far older. Jonathan removed his hat, walking respectfully between the stones. Many markers had fallen, others leaned at impossible angles. The oldest inscriptions had almost disappeared beneath time. Still, several names remained readable. Mary Ellsworth, Joseph Briggs, Thomas Rowan, Rebecca Finch. Families, children, ordinary people, people who once laughed, worked,
celebrated harvests, watched seasons change, exactly as the people of Ashbrook did now. He paused before one unusually large headstone standing near the center. Its inscription remained surprisingly clear. In loving memory of those who built this place with hope. Beneath those words, someone had carefully chiseled away the village's name. Only rough marks remained, deliberately erased. Jonathan ran his fingers across the stone. The missing letters could no longer be recovered. Who would erase the name of an entire village, and why? A cool breeze swept gently through the cemetery. Several yellow leaves drifted across the old graves. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to imagine the place as it once had been. Children running between cottages, women hanging laundry beneath the afternoon sun, blacksmiths working beside glowing forges, families gathering for evening meals. A peaceful village, just like Ashbrook. Then, gone. Not destroyed, not burned, simply forgotten. The afternoon sun began descending toward the western hills. Jonathan realized he should return before darkness. As he turned toward the old road, he heard something, very softly. Laughter. Children's laughter. It floated gently through the trees, bright, joyful, far away. Jonathan stopped walking, listened carefully. The laughter lasted only a few seconds.
Jonathan remained standing outside his cottage long after Elias Morton had disappeared down the quiet village road. The folded note rested gently in his hand. Its paper felt unusually smooth despite its age. He turned it over several times, searching for another sentence, a signature, even the faint impression of forgotten writing beneath the surface. There was nothing, only the 12 words. When the 7th bell rings, do not follow the road before sunrise. He looked toward the western sky. The last light of day had faded behind the hills, leaving Ashbrook wrapped in soft evening shadows. Lanterns glowed warmly behind cottage windows, and the comforting smell of fresh bread drifted through the cool autumn air. Everything appeared peaceful, yet Jonathan could no longer look upon the village without wondering how many quiet secrets rested beneath its ordinary appearance. That evening, he decided not to write immediately. Instead, he walked slowly through Ashbrook, observing the familiar rhythm of village life. Mrs. Carter sat on her porch, knitting a wool blanket. The blacksmith carefully closed the doors of his workshop. Children carried buckets of water home before darkness settled over the valley. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet Jonathan noticed something he had overlooked countless times before. Nearly every home possessed a small brass bell hanging beside its front door. Some were polished, others had grown dull with age. They differed in size and shape, but every single house had one. Curious, he approached Mr. Samuel Carter, who was securing his barn. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." Jonathan pointed toward the little bell. "Why does every family keep one?" Samuel looked briefly at the bell before smiling. "My father always said, every home deserves a voice." "A voice?" "In case neighbors ever need one another." Jonathan nodded politely. It sounded reasonable, yet something about the answer felt incomplete, just as so many answers in Ashbrook had begun to feel. The following morning dawned bright and unusually warm. Golden sunlight
poured across the fields, while gentle winds carried the scent of drying leaves through the valley. After lessons ended, Jonathan made his way toward Elias Morton's orchard. The elderly man sat beneath one of the oldest apple trees, carefully repairing a woven basket. "I hoped you'd come," Elias said, before Jonathan spoke a single word. Jonathan smiled. "I've brought the note." Elias looked at it without reaching for it. "I've seen those words before." Jonathan's eyes widened. "You have?" "When I was a boy." "Who wrote them?" "I don't know." "Were they given to you?" "No. I found one tucked inside my father's Bible after he died." Jonathan sat quietly beside him. "What did your father say about the seventh bell?" Elias slowly shook his head. "He never lived long enough to explain." The old man looked toward the northern forest, but he always became uneasy whenever October arrived. Jonathan hesitated before asking another question. "Has anyone ever counted the bells?" Elias smiled faintly. "Every child does." "And?" "They always stop at 6. Jonathan frowned. "I don't understand." "Neither do I." The answer settled gently between them. Another mystery, another doorway opening onto questions no one could fully answer. Later that afternoon, Jonathan returned to the church archive beneath the meeting house. This time, Reverend Brooks left him alone among the shelves. Hours passed quietly as Jonathan searched through journals, family letters, harvest records, and faded church announcements. Most described ordinary village life: births, weddings, good harvests, hard winters. Nothing unusual. Then, hidden inside a bundle of loose papers, he discovered a single handwritten calendar. It had been prepared nearly 60 years earlier. Most dates contained ordinary notes: repair bridge, harvest apples, community supper. Then Jonathan noticed one entry written in darker ink: October 22nd. Remain indoors before dawn. No explanation, no reason, just that one simple instruction. He searched another calendar. Again, October 22nd. Do not leave until after sunrise. A third calendar, different handwriting, different year, the very same instruction. Jonathan spread the calendars across the table. The dates formed an unmistakable pattern. Every 7 years, the same warning appeared. Always in October, always on the 22nd day. Tomorrow would be October 22nd. His heartbeat quickened. As evening approached, Jonathan climbed the church bell tower. The narrow wooden stairs creaked softly beneath his boots. At the top, cool wind swept across the valley. From there, he could see nearly all of Ashbrook: 36 cottages, the winding creek, golden fields stretching toward distant hills, and beyond them, the endless northern forest. The abandoned road itself remained hidden beneath the trees, yet Jonathan knew exactly where it lay. He reached out and gently touched the great bronze church bell. Its surface had grown smooth after decades of use. Along the lower rim, someone had engraved a sentence so worn that only a few words were remaining visible. Until the morning. Nothing else could be read. He wondered whether the missing words might once have explained everything, or nothing at all. Descending from the tower, Jonathan noticed several villagers gathering quietly outside the church. No one appeared frightened, no one hurried. Instead, families spoke in soft voices while carrying candles, blankets, baskets of bread, and jugs of fresh water into the meeting house. Children helped without asking questions. Even the youngest seemed to know exactly what to do. Jonathan approached Mrs. Abigail Turner. "Is something happening tomorrow?" She smiled kindly. Tomorrow is simply tomorrow. Then why is everyone preparing? We've always prepared. For what? She looked toward the meeting house, so that everyone is together before dawn. Jonathan felt a chill. Before dawn? Mrs. Turner nodded. It has always been our custom. Again, the same answer. Always. That night, the village supper felt different. Long tables filled the meeting house as they always had. Fresh bread, stew, apple butter, roasted vegetables, warm cider. Families laughed softly together. Children played gentle games near the fireplace. An outsider might have seen nothing unusual, yet Jonathan noticed every family remained remarkably close together. Parents rarely allowed children out of sight. Grandparents sat beside grandchildren. Neighbors quietly checked on one another throughout the evening, not from fear, from habit, a tradition repeated so many times that no one questioned it. Near the end of supper, Reverend Brooks stood. The room gradually became silent. Instead of delivering a sermon, he simply spoke a few peaceful words. As our parents watched over us, so we watch over one another. Everyone answered together, as those before us did. Jonathan had never heard those words before, yet every villager knew them by heart. Later, much later, after the meeting house emptied, Jonathan returned home carrying his lantern. The moon hung low above the trees. A gentle mist had begun forming over the creek. He paused beside the bridge. The water reflected countless stars. Everything appeared calm. Then, very softly, a bell rang. One clear note. Not Ashbrook's church bell, the distant one, hidden somewhere beyond the forest. Jonathan listened carefully. A second bell answered, then a third, each separated by nearly a minute, slow, patient, unhurried. Jonathan counted quietly. 1, 2, 3. The sounds drifted across the valley like gentle echoes from another age. Then came the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Silence followed, long enough that Jonathan wondered whether the linging had ended. He remembered the note, "When the seventh bell rings." The forest stood perfectly still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Jonathan's hand tightened around the lantern. Far away, Jonathan remained beside the bridge until the last echo of the seventh bell disappeared into the stillness of the valley. The night became impossibly quiet. Not even the creek seemed eager to disturb the silence. He looked once more toward the northern forest. The tiny lights had vanished. Only darkness remained beneath the towering trees. Slowly, he returned to his cottage. The folded note rested safely inside his coat pocket. When the seventh bell rings, do not follow the road before sunrise. It was the clearest warning anyone had given him. Unlike the old traditions, it contained no mystery of language. It simply asked him not to go. Yet Jonathan knew sleep would never come unless he understood why. Inside his cottage, he lit only a single candle. Its warm glow filled the small room with soft shadows. He spread his maps across the table one final time. The abandoned road, the hidden foundations, the old cemetery, the well, the carved symbol. Everything pointed toward one forgotten place. Still, something troubled him. Every warning he had received shared one curious detail. No one had ever said, "Never go." Instead, they always said, "Do not go before sunrise." Why did the hour matter? If the place itself were dangerous, daylight would make little difference, unless the danger belonged only to the darkness. Or perhaps the darkness belonged to something else entirely. Hours passed. The candles slowly burned lower. Outside, the village remained unusually active. Soft footsteps crossed the road. Doors opened and closed. Families quietly gathered inside the meeting house, exactly as Mrs. Turner had described. There was no panic, no shouting, only peaceful preparation. Jonathan opened his front door just slightly. Across the village, warm lantern light glowed through the meeting house windows. Almost everyone appeared to be inside. Children slept beneath blankets spread across the wooden floor. Parents spoke quietly together. Grandparents rocked gently in their chairs. It looked less like a shelter and more like a family tradition practiced for generations. Only one person remained outside, Reverend Brooks. He stood alone beneath the church bell, gazing toward the northern forest. His hat rested in his hands. His expression carried neither fear nor sadness, only respect. After several moments, he quietly entered the church and closed the heavy wooden doors. Ashbrook fell silent once again. Jonathan looked toward the clock resting upon his shelf. Nearly 4 a.m. Sunrise would not arrive for another hour. He knew exactly what he should do. Stay inside, wait, honor the warning. Instead, he reached for his lantern. "I'll only look," he whispered to himself. "I'll return before the sun rises." The words sounded reassuring, yet somewhere deep inside, he already suspected they were untrue. The abandoned road welcomed him with remarkable stillness. A thin layer of mist drifted just above the ground, weaving gently between ancient tree trunks. His lantern cast a soft circle of golden light before him. Every step seemed louder than it should have. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The fallen leaves whispered beneath his boots. Soon, even those sounds faded. The forest floor became strangely smooth. The mist grew thicker. Jonathan realized something unusual. The air no longer smelled of pine or damp earth. Instead, it carried the faint scent of fresh bread, wood smoke, apple blossoms, impossible scents for a cold October forest before dawn. He continued walking. The familiar clearing appeared ahead, only it was no longer empty. Jonathan stopped. His lantern trembled ever so slightly. The stone foundations had disappeared. In their place stood wooden cottages, dozens of them, simple homes lined narrow streets, exactly where the ruined foundations had rested the previous afternoon. Warm light glowed beneath tiny windows. Thin streams of smoke drifted peacefully from stone chimneys. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A rooster crowed. Jonathan stared in complete silence. The abandoned settlement was alive. No thunder cracked across the sky. No magical light filled the valley. The village simply existed, as naturally as Ashbrook itself. It looked neither ghostly nor strange. It looked ordinary. A woman swept the front steps of a cottage. An elderly man stacked wood fire beside a fence. 2 boys chased one another down the narrow lane, laughing softly. A baker carried warm loaves from a brick oven. Every scene appeared wonderfully familiar. Jonathan slowly lowered his lantern. His heart beat quickly, yet he felt no fear, only overwhelming curiosity. He stepped carefully onto the village street. No one seemed surprised to see him. In fact, several villagers smiled politely as they passed. One elderly gentleman even tipped his hat. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. Jonathan hesitated. "Good morning." The man continued walking as though nothing unusual had happened. Jonathan turned slowly. The buildings looked beautifully maintained. Flower boxes rested beneath windows. Freshly painted fences surrounded gardens. Laundry fluttered gently upon laundry clines. Children laughed beside a hand pump. Everything suggested a thriving little community. exactly the kind of peaceful settlement found throughout early America. Then why had every map erased it? He wandered slowly through the quiet streets. The architecture resembled Ashbrook's, though slightly older. Many homes displayed the same carved symbol he had found upon the great oak, the circle, the six-pointed star. Above one doorway, someone had carved a date, 1726. Jonathan paused. That was 2 years before the mysterious graves in Ashbrook. His thoughts raced. Had this village existed before Ashbrook? Had the settlers simply moved? No, that could not explain why its name had been removed from every record. Near the center of the settlement stood the stone well. Only now it appeared new. Its stones shone pale beneath the lantern light. Water rested deep inside, clear enough to reflect the fading stars overhead. Jonathan leaned forward. Instead of his own reflection, for the briefest instant he thought he saw another face, an older man, calm, watching him. Jonathan blinked. The reflection became his own once more. The water remained perfectly still. Footsteps approached behind him. He turned. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, stood quietly holding a small wicker basket filled with apples. Her long brown hair rested beneath a simple linen bonnet. She smiled kindly. "You came early." Jonathan knelt so they stood nearly eye to eye. "I suppose I did." She looked toward the eastern horizon. "You should leave before the sun remembers." Jonathan frowned gently. "Before the sun remembers?" The girl nodded certainly. "It always remembers." "What does that mean?" She thought carefully. "As long as the stars are awake, we may borrow the morning." Her answer carried the simple certainty only children possess. Jonathan smiled. "What is this village called?" The little girl looked surprised. "You don't know?" "No." She glanced around as if expecting someone else to answer. Finally, she whispered the name, Hollow Creek. Jonathan repeated it softly, Hollow Creek. The words felt strangely familiar, as though he had heard them long ago in a dream. "Is this your home?" She nodded happily. "It has always been." She held out one bright red apple. "For your walk." Jonathan accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you." Before he could ask another question, the church bell rang. One gentle note, not loud, not alarming, simply clear. Every villager stopped what they were doing. The baker, the children, the woman sweeping her porch, everyone turned toward the eastern sky. Jonathan followed their gaze. A faint ribbon of pale gold had appeared above the distant hills. Dawn. The little girl's smile slowly faded. "You must go now."
Jonathan Hale did not run. Although every instinct urged him to hurry, he forced himself to walk with slow, measured steps along the forgotten road. Behind him, the quiet streets of Hollow Creek continued dissolving into the pale light of dawn. One cottage disappeared, then another. Stone walls softened into drifting mist. Garden fences faded like reflections upon still water. The warm glow inside every window slowly surrendered to the morning. Jonathan looked back only once. The little girl still stood beside the well. She smiled exactly as she had before, peaceful, kind, unafraid. She lifted her hand in farewell. Jonathan returned the gesture. A heartbeat later, the sunlight reached her feet. She vanished as gently as morning fog. No flash, no shadow, no sound. Only empty air remained. Within moments, Hollow Creek had become a quiet forest once again. The stone foundations returned. The ruined well grew old
beneath blankets of moss. Ancient trees stood where tidy cottages had rested only moments before. The village had not been destroyed. It had simply stepped away from the daylight. Jonathan continued toward Ashbrook. His thoughts raced faster than his footsteps. Had he dreamed? Fatigue could play strange tricks upon the mind. Perhaps weeks of unanswered questions had finally woven themselves into a vivid imagination. Then he remembered the apple, still resting in his coat pocket. He reached inside. Its smooth skin felt cool beneath his fingers. He withdrew it carefully. Bright crimson, perfectly round. Not a single bruise marked its surface. Fresh dew still shimmered upon it. Jonathan smiled quietly. Dreams did not leave apples behind. Ashbrook greeted him with the familiar sounds of morning. Children laughed beside the creek. Smoke curled upward from chimneys. The blacksmith had already begun striking glowing iron upon his anvil. Everything appeared wonderfully ordinary. No one seemed alarmed. No one rushed through the streets. Instead, villagers quietly returned to their daily routines, as though the hours before sunrise had been no different than any other autumn morning. Jonathan wondered whether anyone else remembered the distant bells, or whether remembering had become another silent custom. Near the bakery, Mrs. Abigail Turner stood arranging fresh loaves inside a wooden basket. She looked up as Jonathan approached. "You were awake early." "I was." Her eyes drifted toward the apple in his hand. For the briefest moment, she stopped breathing. "You found it." Jonathan looked down. "You know this apple?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she gently touched the fruit with trembling fingers. "I haven't seen one since I was younger than you." Jonathan stared at her. "Then you've been there?" Mrs. Turner smiled softly. "We all have." The words settled between them like falling leaves. Jonathan spoke almost in a whisper. "Hollow Creek." The elderly woman's eyes slowly closed. "You remember the name." "It was never forgotten?" "No. It was protected." They sat together upon the bench outside her cottage. Morning sunlight warmed the old wooden porch while sparrows hopped peacefully across the nearby fence. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jonathan asked, "Why does everyone pretend it never existed?" Mrs. Turner watched the distant forest. "Because pretending became easier than explaining." "What happened there?" She sighed gently. "That answer was lost before my grandmother was born." She smiled faintly. "Some said a terrible illness came. Others believed the river changed its course. A few whispered that the settlers themselves chose to leave." "And the oldest stories?" Jonathan asked. "What do they say?" Mrs. Turner looked toward the north. "They say Hollow Creek loved the valley too much to leave it." Jonathan frowned gently. "I don't understand." "Neither does anyone else." That afternoon, Jonathan returned to the hidden archive beneath the church. Reverend Brooks listened quietly as Jonathan described everything: the streets, the cottages, the well, the little girl, the apple. The Reverend interrupted only once. "What color were the shutters?" Jonathan blinked. "Blue." The Reverend smiled sadly. "So they are. You believe me?" I've never doubted that Hollow Creek exists. Jonathan stared at him. You've seen it? The Reverend nodded. Only once, when I was 16. What happened? I was told exactly what you were told. Leave before the sunlight reaches the well. And you obeyed? I did. Jonathan hesitated. What would have happened if you hadn't? The Reverend looked into the fireplace where small flames danced quietly among glowing oak logs. No one truly knows, but no one has ever wished to discover the answer. The Reverend walked toward one of the oldest shelves in the archive. From behind several large record books, he removed a narrow wooden box sealed with a tiny brass latch. I've been waiting many years to open this. For me? For whoever returned carrying proof. Inside rested several carefully preserved objects: a child's wooden spinning top, a silver thimble, a faded blue ribbon, and another apple. Jonathan's eyes widened. It looked identical to the apple resting in his hand, bright, fresh, untouched by time. How old is this? He whispered. 56 years. Jonathan stared in disbelief. It hasn't spoiled. No. No one knows why. The Reverend gently lifted the fruit. It was brought back by my grandfather. He visited Hollow Creek? He did. And after that, he never returned. Jonathan looked confused. He came home, didn't he? He came home physically. The Reverend's voice grew quieter. But every morning afterwards, he walked to the northern bridge before sunrise and simply stood there. For 23 years. Waiting. Waiting for what? The Reverend smiled sadly. He never said. Jonathan remained in the archive until evening. Together they examined old journals, forgotten sketches, and faded letters. One drawing caught Jonathan's attention immediately. It showed Hollow Creek exactly as he had seen it. The cottages, the church, the well, even the enormous white oak standing beyond the last house. Beneath the sketch, someone had written a single sentence. The village remembers everyone who remembers it. No name, no date, only those words. That night, Jonathan sat outside his cottage beneath a sky filled with countless stars. The mysterious apple rested beside him. He polished it gently with his sleeve. Still fresh, still fragrant, as though it had been picked only minutes earlier. Across the village, lanterns slowly disappeared one by one. Children wished their parents good night. Dogs curled beside warm fireplaces. The familiar peace of Ashbrook settled gently over the valley. Jonathan looked toward the northern forest. His curiosity had changed. At first, he wanted answers. Now, he wanted understanding. Hollow Creek no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a memory waiting patiently to be heard. Just before midnight, a cool breeze drifted through the trees, carrying with it not the sound of bells, not footsteps, but music. A simple violin, soft, gentle.
Jonathan hauntingly unfolded the parchment once more beneath the soft glow of his lantern. Come tomorrow night. The storyteller has been waiting. There was no signature, no seal, no clue as to who had written it. Yet Jonathan somehow knew exactly where the invitation had come from. Not Ashbrook, Hollow Creek. He carefully folded the parchment and slipped it into his journal.
Outside, the village rested beneath a blanket of quiet stars. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called gently before silence settled over the valley once again. Jonathan slept peacefully for the first time in many nights. The following day passed with remarkable calm. The children practiced their handwriting. Farmers gathered the last pumpkins from the fields before winter. Mrs. Turner baked fresh bread for nearly half the village. Even the weather seemed unusually gentle, as though the village itself wished to remain undisturbed. Jonathan noticed something else. The villagers smiled more often today. Not because anything special had happened, but because October 22nd had passed. A quiet weight seemed to have lifted from everyone's shoulders. No one spoke about it. No explanation was offered. Still, the change could be felt. That afternoon, Jonathan visited Reverend Brooks. "I received another message," he said. The Reverend nodded before Jonathan even removed the parchment from his pocket. "I expected you would." "You knew?" "I hoped." Jonathan placed the folded invitation upon the table. "Who is the storyteller?" The Reverend looked thoughtfully into the fireplace. "I've never met them." "You've never gone back?" "No." "You would know if I didn't return." "Yes." "My grandfather told me that not everyone receives an invitation." "And those who do?" "They must decide for themselves." Jonathan smiled gently. "Would you go?" The Reverend considered the question for a long moment. Finally, he answered, 40 years ago, I would have gone searching for answers. And now? Now I understand that some answers arrive only when they choose." Night returned quietly. Just before midnight, Jonathan packed the same satchel he had carried before. This time he added only one more item, his journal. If Hollow Creek truly wished to tell its story, he wanted to remember every word. The moon hung low above the forest as he followed the forgotten road. Mist drifted peacefully between the ancient trees. The familiar scent of fresh bread slowly returned. Then wood smoke. Then apple blossoms. The forest grew wonderfully still. Ahead, warm lights appeared one by one. Hollow Creek was awakening. Just as before, cottages emerged gently from the darkness. Lanterns glowed behind windows. Dogs barked softly. A baker opened his wooden shutters. Children laughed somewhere beyond the village square. Nothing felt hurried, nothing felt unnatural. The village simply welcomed another quiet night. As Jonathan entered the main street, several villagers greeted him with warm smiles. "Good evening. Welcome back. We hoped you would return." Their kindness surprised him. No one seemed curious about the stranger walking among them. Instead, they behaved as though he were an old friend who had merely been away for some time. The little girl who had given him the apple appeared once again beside the well. She wore the same linen bonnet, the same gentle smile. "You came." "I did." "He is waiting." "Who?" "The storyteller." She pointed toward the northern edge of the village. Beyond the last cottages stood a small cabin unlike the others. It was older, simpler. Its roof sagged slightly beneath the weight of many seasons. Warm candlelight glowed through a single window. Jonathan thanked the little girl. She simply smiled. He likes visitors. The cabin door stood slightly open. Jonathan knocked softly. A calm voice answered from within. "I've been expecting you, Jonathan Hale." Jonathan stepped inside. The room smelled of cedar wood and old books. Shelves lined every wall. Hundreds of journals rested neatly beside carefully rolled maps. Bundles of letters filled wooden boxes. Paintings leaned against the walls. Everywhere Jonathan looked, someone had been preserving memories. Near the fireplace sat an elderly man with long silver hair tied neatly behind his neck. His face carried countless wrinkles, yet his bright blue eyes seemed remarkably young. He closed the journal he had been writing, then smiled warmly. "Please, sit." Jonathan took the chair opposite him. "I don't believe we've met." The old man chuckled softly. "No, but I've known about you since the day you arrived in Ashbrook." Jonathan blinked. "How?" "The valley remembers." Seeing Jonathan's confusion, the old man laughed again. "I should begin properly." He extended one weathered hand. "My name is Elias Rowan." Jonathan's eyes widened. "The Rowan family?" "The same." "I saw your name in the old cemetery." "You saw my grandfather's name, not mine." Jonathan hesitated. "Then, how old are you?" The old man smiled toward the fire. "Old enough to have forgotten the importance of counting." For several peaceful minutes, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly. Outside, gentle laughter drifted through the quiet streets. Finally, Jonathan asked, "Are you the storyteller?" "I am." "What exactly do you do?" Elias Rowan looked around the little cabin. "I remember. That is all." Jonathan glanced toward the shelves. "So these journals are memories. Every birth, every wedding, every harvest, every snowfall, every farewell. Nothing is too small to deserve remembering." Jonathan smiled. "I keep journals too." "I know. You read beautifully." Jonathan was genuinely surprised. "You've read them?" "No, but memory has many paths." The storyteller stood slowly and removed a large leather-bound book from the highest shelf. It appeared older than any journal Jonathan had ever seen. The leather had darkened almost to black. Its pages had become golden with age. He placed it carefully upon the table. "This is Hollow Creek." Jonathan frowned. "It looks like a book." "It is." He gently opened the cover. Inside were thousands of names, families, birthdays, simple notes, sketches of cottages, recipes, children's drawings, pressed flowers, pieces of ribbon, even tiny handwritten jokes. Jonathan turned the pages in wonder. "This is the history of the village." "No." The storyteller poured 2 cups of warm cider. "Long ago," he began, "Hollow Creek was exactly like Ashbrook. We farmed, we laughed, we celebrated weddings, we argued over fences, we worried about harsh winters. Life was beautifully ordinary." Jonathan listened in complete silence. Then, one autumn, the old man's voice became softer. A sickness spread through neighboring settlements. Families left the valley searching for safer lands. Many promised they would return. Most never did. Jonathan nodded slowly. "What happened to those who stayed?" "They feared Hollow Creek would slowly vanish from memory. So they made a promise." "A promise?" "That as long as someone remembered the village with kindness, Hollow Creek would never truly disappear." Jonathan looked toward the window. Outside, lanterns glowed peacefully along the quiet street. "So that's why it appears before sunrise." The storyteller smiled. "Not because it is haunted, not because it is cursed, but because memory is strongest during the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is still enough to listen. Jonathan sat without speaking. The explanation felt strangely beautiful, not supernatural in the frightening sense, but deeply human. A village survived because it was remembered.
The Village That Disappeared Before Sunrise, Part 11, The Promise Kept Until Dawn. The violin continued its gentle melody long after the storyteller had fallen silent. Its notes drifted through the quiet streets of Hollow Creek like autumn leaves carried by a patient breeze. Jonathan Hale sat comfortably beside the fire. For the first time since discovering the forgotten road, he no longer felt the weight of unanswered questions. Instead, he felt something quieter: gratitude. The old storyteller poured another cup of warm cider before placing another journal upon the wooden table. Unlike the others, this one looked surprisingly new. Its leather was smooth, its pages were crisp. Jonathan opened the cover. The first page was blank. Only one sentence had been written near the bottom: "For the next keeper of gentle memories." Jonathan looked up. "What is this?" Elias smiled. "It has been waiting." For whom? For the first visitor who wished to understand instead of possess. Jonathan carefully closed the journal again. "I don't understand." "You came looking for answers." "Yes." "You could have returned with stories of haunted forests and disappearing ghosts." Jonathan nodded quietly. "But you didn't. You noticed the gardens, the children, the bread, the music. You saw people, not mysteries." The old storyteller's eyes shone warmly in the firelight. "That is why Hollow Creek welcomed you." Outside, life continued peacefully. Neighbors spoke quietly beneath lantern light. A baker carried fresh loaves toward the village square. Several children sat together listening to an elderly woman tell a bedtime story. Nothing extraordinary happened. And perhaps that was the greatest wonder of all. Jonathan realized the forgotten village had never wished to astonish visitors. It wished only to be remembered as it truly had been, a place where ordinary lives mattered. After a long silence, Jonathan asked the question that had quietly rested in his heart since the beginning. Why was the village's name erased from the maps? Elias Rowan leaned back comfortably in his chair. Because maps are not memories. Jonathan waited. The old storyteller continued. When Hollow Creek's families began leaving the valley, they understood something. If travelers continued searching for the village, they would eventually find only empty forest. They would believe the stories false. They would laugh. They would forget. So the remaining families made an unusual choice. They asked future surveyors to remove the village from official maps. Jonathan blinked. They chose to disappear? They chose to protect remembrance from disappointment. The answer settled gently into the quiet room. Jonathan imagined generations of mapmakers carefully leaving a single blank place, not because nothing had existed there, but because something precious still did. The storyteller reached beneath the table and removed an old wooden box.
Inside rested dozens of carefully folded letters. Some had faded nearly white with age. Others appeared surprisingly recent. What are these? Letters. To whom? To Hollow Creek. Jonathan smiled softly. People write to a village? They always have. Elias unfolded one fragile letter. Its date read October 23rd, 1742. He read only a few lines. Dear Hollow Creek, the apples tasted sweeter this year. My youngest daughter has learned to read. Though we now live beyond the mountains, I still remember the sound of your creek each autumn. The storyteller folded it once more. There are hundreds. Jonathan looked through the box. Letters from soldiers, teachers, mothers, carpenters, children. Some were only a few sentences. Others stretched across many pages. Each ended almost the same way. I remember. Does anyone answer them? Jonathan asked. The old man smiled. Every year. Jonathan looked puzzled. How? Elias pointed toward the shelves filled with journals. By remembering them in return. The fire burned lower. Outside, stars slowly drifted westward across the sky. Jonathan realized dawn was several hours away. He had lost all sense of time, not because the night felt strange, but because it felt wonderfully peaceful. The storyteller suddenly stood. There is someone who wishes to meet you. Jonathan followed him outside. The streets glowed beneath warm lanterns. Near the old well stood the little girl who first offered Jonathan an apple. She held a small woven basket. Inside rested several tiny objects: a smooth river stone, a pressed maple leaf, a feather, a blue ribbon, and a simple wooden whistle. She smiled brightly. These are for you. Jonathan knelt beside her. What are they? Our remembering things. Our teacher says every family keeps some, so they never forget little moments. Jonathan gently picked up the feather. It belonged to a bluebird. Beautiful, delicate, perfectly preserved. My father found this the day I learned to walk, the little girl explained proudly. She held up the smooth river stone. My brother skipped this across the creek 7 times. Then the maple leaf. My grandmother pressed this on her wedding day.
Jonathan Hale reached Ashbrook just as the first rays of sunlight spread across the valley. Behind him, Hollow Creek slowly faded into the quiet embrace of the forest. There was no sadness in its disappearance. Jonathan now understood that the village was not lost. It simply belonged to another rhythm of time, a place that awoke only when the world became quiet enough to remember. The apple remained safely inside his satchel. The little brass key rested in his pocket, and beneath his arm the blank leather journal felt heavier than before, not because of its weight, but because of its purpose.
the village of Ashbrook greeted another peaceful autumn morning. Children hurried toward the schoolhouse. The blacksmith opened his workshop. Mrs. Abigail Turner swept the front porch of her cottage. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet when Jonathan passed the older villagers, many smiled knowingly. No questions were asked. None were needed. They saw the journal. That alone told them everything. Mrs. Turner placed one gentle hand upon his shoulder. "So, you met him?" Jonathan nodded. "The storyteller." She smiled. "My grandmother always believed someone eventually would." That evening, Jonathan opened the blank journal. For a long time, he simply stared at the empty pages. He realized something important. He could write every mystery, every strange event, every impossible moment. Or he could write what truly mattered. He dipped his pen into fresh ink. On the very first page, he wrote, "This is not the story of a vanished village. It is the story of a village that was loved so deeply that its memory refused to disappear." He smiled quietly. Then he began writing. Weeks became months. Winter snow gently covered the valley. The creek froze beneath delicate sheets of ice. Children laughed while building snowmen beside the church. Jonathan continued writing every evening beside the fireplace. He described Hollow Creek exactly as he had seen it. The warm bread, the blue shutters, the laughter of children, the old well, the violin beneath the oak tree, the little girl who offered him an apple, the storyteller who believed memories deserved homes. He never exaggerated. He never tried to make the story frightening. He simply told the truth as he had experienced it. When spring finally returned, Jonathan carried the completed journal to Reverend Brooks. The Reverend turned its pages slowly. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he quietly wiped away a tear. Finally, he closed the book. "You have done something remarkable." Jonathan shook his head. "I only wrote what happened." "No," the Reverend replied gently. "You remembered with kindness. There is a difference." Together, they placed the journal inside the church archive, not hidden, not locked away, simply resting beside the older histories of Ashbrook. Above it, Reverend Brooks attached a small wooden plaque. It read, "For anyone who listens before judging." Jonathan thought that was exactly where the book belonged. Years passed peacefully. Jonathan grew older. Children he had once taught became parents themselves. New families arrived in Ashbrook. Others moved away. Life followed the steady rhythm it always had. Yet one tradition quietly continued. All autumn, on the evening before October 22nd, the villagers gathered inside the meeting house. They shared bread, warm cider, music, stories. Children always asked the same question: "Why do we gather before dawn?" The adults always answered with gentle smiles: "So no place we have loved is ever left alone." The children accepted the answer. One day they would understand. Jonathan never again searched for Hollow Creek. He never needed to. Sometimes, late at night, he heard the distant violin drifting softly across the valley. Other times, 7 quiet bell tones echoed through the autumn darkness. He always smiled, then returned to whatever story he happened to be writing, because he knew some friendships did not require constant visits, only faithful remembrance. Many decades later, Jonathan Hale's hair had turned completely white. His hands trembled slightly whenever he held a pen. Yet every evening he still walked to the bridge overlooking Ash Creek. He always carried the same small brass key. One autumn evening, a young boy approached him. "Mr. Hale?" Jonathan looked up with a warm smile. "Yes?" "My grandfather says you know the oldest story in the valley." Jonathan chuckled softly. "I know one of them." The boy sat beside him. "Will you tell me?" Jonathan looked toward the northern forest, where golden leaves danced gently in the evening breeze. Then he began. Long ago, there was a peaceful village called Hollow Creek. The boy listened with wide, curious eyes. Not once did he interrupt. When the story finally ended, twilight had settled over the valley. The boy remained silent for several moments. Then he asked, "Is it true?" Jonathan smiled. "What do you think?" The boy looked toward the forest. "I think some stories stay alive because people keep telling them." Jonathan nodded. "I couldn't have said it better." That night, Jonathan returned home. On his writing desk rested the old leather journal given to him by the storyteller. Its pages were now completely filled. He opened the final page. There, in neat handwriting, he wrote his last entry. "If you are reading this many years from now, walk gently through every place you visit. Listen carefully to old voices. Treasure ordinary days. For buildings become ruins, maps become outdated, names fade from stone, but kindness remembered can outlive them all." Jonathan placed the pen beside the journal, blew out the candle, and smiled peacefully into the quiet autumn night. Many years after Jonathan's passing, Ashbrook changed. New houses appeared, the old bridge was rebuilt, the school grew larger. The world beyond the valley moved faster than anyone could imagine. Yet all autumn, without anyone needing to be reminded, families still gathered before sunrise. Children still carried warm blankets into the meeting house. Fresh bread still filled the air with its comforting scent. No one called it a ritual. No one spoke of fear. They simply remembered. Because memory, they had learned, was not about holding on to the past. It was about carrying love forward. On one particularly quiet autumn morning, just before sunrise, a young traveler entered the valley. He noticed an old wagon road disappearing into the northern forest. He paused. For reasons he could not explain, the path felt strangely familiar. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, a gentle violin began to play. Moments later, a distant church bell rang once, then twice, then a third time. The traveler smiled without knowing why. Far away, hidden beyond the waking forest, a peaceful little village quietly opened its windows once again. And somewhere inside a small cedar cabin, the first page of a brand new journal slowly turned by itself, waiting patiently for the next keeper of gentle memories.
Many years passed. The seasons continued their endless journey across the quiet valley. Spring covered the hills with wildflowers. Summer filled the orchards with sweet apples. Autumn painted every forest in gold and crimson. Winter wrapped the village beneath peaceful blankets of snow. Ashbrook changed, as every place eventually does. Children grew into parents. Parents became grandparents. Old cottages were repaired. New barns were raised. The world beyond the valley became larger and faster with each passing generation. Railroads reached nearby towns. Newspapers arrived every morning. People spoke of distant cities and marvelous inventions. Yet somehow, Ashbrook remained wonderfully quiet. Not because it feared change, but because it understood that peace was something worth protecting. Jonathan Hale's journals slowly filled an entire shelf beneath the church, then another, then another. Each volume carried simple titles: Autumn 1785, Winter Memories, The Orchard in Bloom, Stories Told Beside the Fire. There were no tales of famous kings, no accounts of great wars, no speeches from powerful men. Instead, Jonathan wrote about ordinary people. Mrs. Turner teaching children to bake bread, Samuel Carter repairing his neighbor's fence without being asked, a little girl returning a lost kitten to its owner, the first robin appearing every spring, the smell of rain drifting across freshly plowed fields. Because Jonathan had learned something very few historians ever discovered. History was not only shaped by extraordinary moments, it was held together by ordinary kindness. One evening, nearly 40 years after Jonathan first discovered the forgotten road, Reverend Brooks visited him. The old minister walked much slower now. His hair had become completely white. Still, his smile remained exactly the same. "I've brought something." He handed Jonathan a small wooden box. Inside rested the tiny brass key. Jonathan looked surprised. "I thought this belonged to Hollow Creek." "It always did." "Then why return it?" Reverend Brooks smiled. "It was never meant to unlock a door. It was meant to remind one person to leave the door open." Jonathan gently closed the box. "I understand. I knew you would." That autumn, Jonathan made one final journey before sunrise. Not because he sought answers, not because curiosity still called him. He simply wished to visit old friends. The forgotten road welcomed him exactly as it had always done. Mist drifted quietly among ancient oaks. The scent of fresh bread floated through the cool morning air. Then, the village appeared. Hollow Creek looked exactly as he remembered. Blue shutters, flower gardens, lanterns glowing warmly behind cottage windows, children laughing near the well. Nothing had changed. Or perhaps everything had. Because Jonathan himself had changed. This time, he did not wander through the streets searching for clues. Instead, he simply enjoyed the morning. He helped the baker carry warm loaves to the square. He listened as children proudly recited poems they had learned. He shared cider with neighbors whose names he now knew by heart. For the first time, he felt less like a visitor and more like an old friend returning home. As dawn slowly approached the valley, the storyteller, Elias Rowan, joined him beneath the great white oak. The old man looked exactly as he had decades before. Calm, kind, patient. "You've finished your book?" Jonathan nodded. "I have. And now?" Jonathan looked toward the eastern sky. "Now I simply remember." The storyteller smiled. "Then my work is finished." Jonathan looked at him. "What do you mean?" The old man rested one weathered hand upon the rough bark of the ancient tree. "For generations, I have kept Hollow Creek's memories. But memories were never meant to belong to one person. They belong to everyone willing to carry them gently." Jonathan understood.
The storyteller had never been chosen because he was extraordinary. He had simply been someone who never allowed kindness to be forgotten. The first rays of sunlight touched the valley. Jonathan prepared to leave. Before he stepped onto the forgotten road, the little girl, the one who had first given him the apple so many years ago, ran towards him. Only now she was no longer a little girl. She had become a young woman. She smiled warmly. "You remembered." Jonathan laughed softly. "I promised I would." She handed him one final gift, a tiny cloth pouch. Inside rested a handful of apple seeds. For Ashbrook. Jonathan looked curiously. Why? So the two villages always bloom together. He carefully placed the seeds inside his coat. Then, with one final wave, he began walking home. Behind him, Hollow Creek slowly disappeared beneath the rising sun. Not lost, simply waiting for another quiet night. That very afternoon, Jonathan planted the apple seeds beside Ash Creek. Children helped him dig the small holes. Nobody asked where the seeds had come from. Some things, they had learned, were most beautiful when left gently unexplained. Years passed. The tiny saplings became strong trees. Every autumn they produced bright red apples like no others in the valley. Sweeter, crisper, almost impossibly fragrant. Whenever visitors asked what made the orchards so special, the villagers simply smiled. They've been growing here longer than anyone remembers. Long after Jonathan Hale's peaceful life came to its natural end, travelers continued arriving in Ashbrook. Some came searching for family history. Others sought quiet places away from busy cities. A few simply became lost while following old country roads. Every so often, someone would notice the forgotten wagon path leading north into the forest. They would ask, "Where does that road go?" The answer was always the same. It leads to an old memory. Most travelers smiled politely and continued their journey. But once in a great while, someone paused. They listened carefully, and if their heart was quiet enough, they heard it. A distant violin, a church bell floating softly through the trees, children laughing somewhere beyond the morning mist. And somewhere near the old stone well, a friendly voice might smile and say, "Welcome, we've been expecting you." So if you ever discover an old story that seems impossible, do not ask first whether it is true. Ask instead why it has survived. Because some stories endure for centuries, not because they are perfect, but because they continue reminding ordinary people to be kinder, to listen more carefully, to treasure peaceful mornings, to protect gentle memories, and to remember those who came before us. For as long as one heart remembers with love, no village, no friendship, and no quiet corner of the world is ever truly gone. The end.